Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Omaha Table Talk. My name is Dominic Green, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the Programs and Faculty Manager at Inclusive Communities. Before we start today's conversation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Native and Indigenous people who lived and took care of the land that most of us gather on today, that belong to the Omaha, Ponca, Pawnee, Oda, Missouri, Santee, Dakota Sioux, Kansas, Iowa, Cheyenne, and Winnebago people. We honor with gratitude and pay our respects to all Native and Indigenous people. Omaha Table Talk, or as we call them OTTs, was initially recreated in Omaha in 2003 by the Social Justice Advisory Committee of Catholic Charities Omaha. In 2012, Inclusive Communities acquired OTT and shifted to a larger public discussion format over comfort food. Now, due to COVID-19, we have shifted to having these events over Zoom this year, but we still welcome you to have a snack or food with you as we have these discussions. We are always looking at ways that we can grow and get better, and invite you to please fill out our evaluation link that will be shared at the end of today's event. At this time, I'd like to thank our Omaha Table Talk sponsors, Lozier Foundation, Cox Communications, and American Family Insurance for their support in having these events continue. At this point, I'm going to invite Colin, excuse me, to share about some housekeeping. Colin.
Perfect. Yeah, Dominic, if you wanted to share that agreement slide here.
Yep.
But before we do those agreements, I'll highlight a couple of things. We're joined by some assistants and supporters of Inclusive Communities, including our ASL interpreter, Pam Duncan, who hopefully will be spotlighted during today's discussion. If you do need to utilize Pam's services during our breakout rooms and table discussions, please let either Dominic or I know. That way we can make sure that she gets placed in a breakout room with you. We're also joined by some facilitators as well. So if those folks want to just kind of give a gallery view wave. Perfect. And then we've just got a couple of things too here in terms of some virtual agreements, things that we think help facilitate a good discussion here on these Zoom rooms. The first one just being remain on camera when you're in those breakout rooms if you're able to. That just kind of helps facilitate the conversation. Always nice to see the people that you're talking to. Another thing to note too is this main session is being recorded. However, those breakout rooms will not be. Remaining on mute while we're in this large group just helps us keep the background noise to a minimum. Limiting those distractions, whether it's a phone or not. And then also feel free to raise your hand either physically, or there's also a Zoom reaction that you can utilize as well. And then the other things that we just wanted to highlight were, feel free, to put things in the chat and utilize that. And then also, if you do, I had the last one here and it just slipped on my, please rename yourself to include pronouns. So your first name and then your pronouns. That way we can make sure we're referring to everyone in the ways in which they want to be referred to in this space. So I think I got everything, so I'll pass it back to Dominic here.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin. And so at this time, I'm going to introduce our moderator. Today's moderator is Tracy Leavelle, and he'll be introducing the panel and our special guest, Tracy.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from Inclusive Communities to participate in this really important conversation. First, we have a special guest, Elder Steve Tamayo, who's going to offer a short blessing.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe from Rosebud, South Dakota. So in my language, we identify ourselves as the Sichungu Lakota. And so I was asked to appear on this Zoom link to offer a blessing, offer a prayer. And so this is a practice for all Indigenous people to offer a blessing, a prayer when we come together as many minds, you know, to help the people. It's always a good practice to be thoughtful in prayer and just to pass on that good vibe. And so with that, I'd like to say this blessing in my Lakota language. And so first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my relatives, my ancestral relatives. Hamataki bi apetikile mechanteta wog la ke hanape choose apolo hemacha si chango Lakota echeleti wahe ke ta sampe oyanke. And so this is once again an official greeting of the Lakota language. And now I'd like to go into my blessing and my prayer. I said to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Wopilataka Chela Petikile Chela Lila Washte Upiloke. I said to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Wopilataka Echele Mini we choni we chose in Iki Ucha or Ste Upilo. I said to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Ushimalayo Echela Makhya. I said to Gashila Wakantaka, Echela wo bilataka, Echela wo aglake, Echela yushkiaki, Echela kota. I said to Gashila Wakantaka, Echela wo bila, Echela wo cheki, Cheta de to bocho, Poste upila. I said to Gashila Wakantaka, Echela wo bilataka, Echela wo uspiaki. I said to Gashila Wakantaka, Echela wo bila, Echela pejuta, Echela hodaki, Echela wachaga. Naha Chanli, Echela Hante Blaska, Ese to Gashilo Kanta Kachela Wo Pilatanka Chela Wo Agalake Yushkiaki. And so in this prayer, I wanted to say a special blessing for each and every one of you and for our communities, for all of our loved ones, for all of our individuals who have been suffering because of this pandemic. And I wanted to say a special blessing for all of our homeless, all of our veterans. And so anybody suffering through this hardship of this pandemic, you know, I wanted to offer a blessing in the four winds in all of their directions. I wanted to acknowledge all of our relatives who are en route from the Wichakbeoyadeki, from the Star Nation world. And I wanted to say a special blessing for this renewal, this springtime. And for us as Indigenous people, this is a rebirth for us. And so this is our new year that we celebrate. And so with that, I want to say, Pilamia Palo, Wobila Tonka, Echala Kota Woglake, Echala Wochekeki. I want to say a special, you know, thank you for each and every one of you for allowing me to be a part of this and to, you know, offer this blessing once again. And with that, I'd like to end that. Hamatako ye, Oyase, Kohechetilo, Toksha.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you also to Nicole for inviting Steve to do this. As Dominic said, my name is Tracy Leavelle. I am the director of the Kingfisher Institute for the Liberal Arts and Professions at Creighton University. I'm also a professor of history there, and the course that I've taught more than any other in my career by far is a general introduction to the history of Native Americans and Indigenous peoples in North America. So I'm just really delighted to be here. And I know from speaking with our guests that this is going to be an excellent and provocative conversation. So we'll start out by allowing each of them to introduce themselves and say, where are you from and what kind of work you do? And since I just mentioned Nicole, let's start with her.
Oh. Nicole Tamayo-Benegas. Hello, my relatives, everybody on the call today. My name is Nicole Benegas. I work at Nebraska Urban Indian Health Coalition, located in downtown Omaha. And I am the SOMS, which is Soaring Over Meth and Suicide Program Director. It is a youth and family program focused on substance abuse, suicide prevention, and kind of just whole person care. We are a kind of catch-all for community services, referrals, advocating for the families that we have in the Omaha metro area. And we do inpatient, transitional living, outpatient treatment here for substance abuse but we also kind of are just a catch-all for how can we advocate and bring the voices of our community members to tables that we have seen them not be there. So that's who I am.
Thank you. Echohawk?
Yat Shea Echohawk Lefthand, She Adosh Azon, no Kappa, Bashus Chain, Ado Shandash Kutao. Hello, my name is Echohawk Lefthand. I am from the Navajo Dene Nation in the Southwest. I am currently employed by Omaha Public Schools as the Indian Education Director. And so my program serves Native American students in the OPS district. So we collaborate a lot with Nicole, and then also Steve Tamayo is our cultural specialist. So good to see him on here and looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. Christina?
Hello, my name is Christina Arellano. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm the Inclusion and Diversity Director for Signature Performance here in Omaha. We basically bring awareness and education to marginalized groups of all kinds in the Omaha metro area within our corporate setting. I am Ute Mountain Ute and Peruvian and lived on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation for about a decade. That's about it for me.
Thank you, Christina. It's nice to see you. Is Ted here? Has Ted made it?
Not yet. We're working on seeing where he's at.
Okay, should we go ahead with the conversation then?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Well, we did some planning and came up with some topics for discussion. So the first question is this. People often relegate Indigenous peoples to the past, as if being Indigenous or Native is associated with things that are no longer present or relevant. So how would you remind people that Indigenous peoples are still here? And let's start with Christina.
You know, that's it's kind of a difficult question. So I've seen both sides, like the reservation life and city life. I was born here in Omaha, moved up there, came back here, and it's definitely two different worlds, that's for sure. How to remind people that we're still here? I guess it's more of a wish. I wish that we were more vocal of a people. Tina Han and I, Rodriguez, and I just had a conversation about DEI work and how, you know, you have to have an off time, but really there is no off time. You know, you're constantly educating people, and anytime the topic can be brought up, I think it should be brought up, and education has to be constant. Those conversations have to be constant because we are definitely still here.
Anyone else want to jump in?
You want to go, Echo?
Well, I think to kind of go along, it is a difficult question, but representation, authenticity of knowledge, places of, I guess going back to, you know, there's more than one Native American tribe in the United States. There's over 570 odd federally recognized, and then there's, you know, going to the thousands of those that aren't recognized for various reasons because of colonization and all of those things. And really, you know, the less tribes that there are, then the less support that the government has to kind of give for Native peoples to be out there. So there was a time that the government was actively trying to terminate, you know, different tribes and reservations across the country. So I guess just knowing more about the Indigenous history from Indigenous peoples, because a lot of times in the textbooks and even here in OPS, you know, last year we had the social studies legislation that kind of changed a little bit of the narrative to where we could be more a part of it. You know, I think some of those things like Montana, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Washington, they have Indian education for all. And so that means, you know, Indian education is history and culture and customs are included in the curriculum, you know, across the board. It doesn't matter if you're on or near a reservation or a tribal nation. You know, it's given in all schools across, you know, the state. And so up in South Dakota, they use the Sheti Shakawan curriculum. I think in Nebraska, that conversation has been had, and that legislation was shot down here a couple years ago. And I think it's kind of picking up more steam again. But, you know, those are some things to help, you know, people understand that Native peoples are here. You know, some of us, we are very bicultural, multicultural. So even though that we as Native people sometimes don't look like what you see in the movies or in the history books, doesn't mean that, you know, we are not Native. You know, there's a whole range of what a Native person looks like to this day, from your very traditional that you see in our regalia to those that, you know, are blonde haired and blue eyed, you know, Native peoples. So you can't just say that, you know, you don't look like these characters in movies and whatnot are Native peoples, but just more awareness, you know, things of that nature. And I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Yeah, I think just along those lines, being aware that we are very much coexisting in all of the spaces that everybody else are in. Many times we are miscategorized as other identities. We carry a lot of identities, like Echo said. You know, I am enrolled Sichango in Rosebud, but I also identify as being Chakrana. And so being able to identify as more than one, definitely giving people the power to do so. But also, I think reminding people that we are, you know, I think we've worked really hard to make spaces at tables that we're not invited to. We are inviting ourselves a lot more because we know that that kind of has been the narrative for us. But I also think if there's something people could really do is helping make those spaces for us be available, giving those opportunities and saying, you know what, we are still forgetting some other people. I think another way is to really kind of spotlight and uplift the work that we are doing, because there is a lot of work that is being done in the Native community within our own selves, but that is not really, I guess, the positive things that we are doing as a community are not highlighted like you see with other communities. And so I think if you are able to support the things that are going on, find out what is going on with the community, even if you don't identify with it.
Thank you. And Echohawk, one thing I would say is that the number one complaint I've heard from my students over the years is that they were not offered an education in these issues. It just wasn't a highlighted part of their curriculum and history and social studies. So, you know, anyway, also I wanted to,
sorry, can I add real quick to that? If we're going to move past us being in history, we have to talk about us in a modern context as well. Because we always talk about we need to include Native history in the schools. We need to, but that's not where we just are at. So being very intentional about talking about that we are very much breathing and living today, and that what are those issues, what are we facing today, and the good work that we're doing present.
Agreed, Nicole. I also want to welcome Ted Hibbeler, who has just joined us. Ted, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly, say who you are and what kind of work you do?
Sure. Hello, my relatives. My name is Ted Hibbeler. I also am from the Sichango Lakota from Rosebud, South Dakota, through the Ironshaw family. I am currently the tribal extension educator for the University of Nebraska. And I work with tribal communities, both in the urban areas and in the rural areas, to establish relationships between the University of Nebraska and the tribal communities here in Nebraska. So I'm glad to be here. Sorry I was late.
Well, we're just glad you're here. Thank you. So the second question I have is, as I think you know, the histories of Native peoples in the United States and indigenous peoples around the world are marked by colonization and genocide. And so the question is, how has historical intergenerational trauma affected indigenous communities? And I'll start that question with Echohawk.
Thanks. And this kind of goes in part to the discussion we had earlier about learning more about indigenous history. A lot of times indigenous history only talks about the impacts that it had for the US nation and what it had done for the European people that came to this land, and, you know, and how they, you know, took over the land, and so to speak. And a lot of people who have settler guilt, I guess you could call it, really it resonates within, you know, people that came here, you know, even though you are the ancestors of these Europeans, and the people of today didn't directly weren't responsible for it. You know, a lot of those things that happened and those atrocities that, you know, the first Europeans had in trying to take over the land, you know, that trauma is deeply rooted in a lot of the different health disparities that, you know, Native peoples have today. You can take education, you can take economic status, you can take even parenting roles, you know, anything with an indigenous, or not just indigenous, but all people's domains of ways of being, it was affected. You know, many times when I talk about intergenerational trauma, and thinking about the Christian faith, I think, what would happen to the Christian peoples if somebody went into Jerusalem and took over those lands and said that those people could no longer practice their faith, you know, and that they were regulated to schools and forced, you know, to speak another language, and, you know, saying that if you ever speak the name of Jesus or anything of that nature, you would be reprimanded, you know, you would be punished. What would that do to that people, you know, and what would how would it affect the core of the family dynamics of those people of that faith? You know, and that's really what it did to Native peoples. Even though our cultures are all different, you know, our languages, our regalia, you know, they're also very similar in the ways of the circle. You know, there's this path that we all kind of follow. With it kind of starts with the sun and a lot of communities, and how do we create, and if you look at the basis of religion, if you look at the basis of you know, the different teachings that these things have, it's all about treating each other in a good way. It's all about raising that next generation to be the best that they can be, to help them to be resilient, you know, trust your neighbor and all those kinds of things. And if you look at the core ethics of it, you know, that is kind of what happened. But, you know, a few years ago when I was attending UNO, I wrote a paper about how Christianity ruined America. Not in the fact that the stuff in the Bible wasn't good, it was just how people interpreted it. And then how those people, you know, used, you know, those that are in the good graces of God are blessed with wealth and all of this kind of stuff, leading to a lot of the capitalism stuff that's going on today. You know, that he who has the most stuff or the most toys is in the best graces of God. And that's how people in the past justified their wealth, and that's why they came here to take over the land and take and extract the minerals and all of the different things that are, you know, going on today. And generational trauma, you know, within our families has created, you know, that stereotype of the drunken Indian, of the uneducated Native person. You look at the media, you look at how Hollywood and John Wayne in the 50s, you know, and even Peter Pan and some of these cartoons and how they portray Native peoples, it's always very barbaric. It's always very kind of just, I guess you could say, savage. And even in the Constitution, that's how, you know, they refer to Native peoples as the savage peoples of this land. And when not, you know, if you look at a lot of the scientific community and the research and what they have done, you know, looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, that was Maslow going into the Blackfoot country, and that that's where he got that from. And then you look at, they call it the social ecological framework, you know, talking about starting from the individual to the family to the community to, you know, everything else. That's very Native centric in how we, as far as Native peoples, view the world. And so there's a lot of things that aren't given credit to what Native peoples have influenced, looking at even the names of many of our states and our cities and our roadways and, you know, all of these different things. And so a lot of the times it's the other side. Native peoples have been belittled. A lot of times Native peoples have not been acknowledged, like, you know, Nicole was talking about, invited to these spaces or to these places to talk. And so multi-generational trauma, I mean, I don't think I'm giving it enough credit, but it's something that is very, very, it can lead to a lot of discouraging talk because there's a lot of ugliness in it. You know, you look at our families that don't have right or correct parenting roles as far as a mother and a father and how they're supposed to be together to help support young people. A lot of that has been lost, either because of relocation efforts in the 50s where families were taken from our nations and put into cities and then saying, well, here you are, you know, try to survive. And so with that culture of survival, a lot of these traditional connections or these cultural connections were lost from one generation to the next. And so I don't want to take up too much time talking about historical trauma, but I also want to give time to everybody else to kind of give their perceptions. But it's, I guess, in the last question you're asking if there's something to learn more about, I mean, this would be it, because it's not just Native peoples, it's, you know, all peoples of color that have undergone some type of historical trauma.
Does anyone else want to add?
And I think this one kind of, you know, goes along with the next question too. They're very connected with everything that we do. You know, echo a lot of what you're talking about is the same thing that I had, you know, to discuss. And I think just putting it into perspective, when you talk about historical trauma, that it wasn't until 1978 that we were able to practice our cultural ways openly and freely. That with the Indian Religious Act that was passed, that was only 43 years ago. So I'm literally the first generation in my family to be born with the right to live a way of life that we had done for centuries prior to colonization and assimilation that was forced on us. So understanding like how does this affect everything, has been something that we've lived with for a long time that is not very historical. And you see that we have come a long way in the last 43 years from being able to figure out how to bring back our practices and our culture. Before, you know, colonization and all of this stuff, we had a way of doing things. We had a structure within our families that everybody had a purpose and had a role to play within their communities and within their family dynamics. Those families consisted of not just, you know, our parents, but it was our extended families that would be considered today. There are all these other people that it's, you know, you say it takes a village to raise a child, and that was the concept that we have always had. But I think, you know, we are in systems that have been set up with a different mindset of what is acceptable and not. And when we continue to allow those systems to determine how we effectively communicate, how we effectively deal with the hardships and struggles that we're going through, it doesn't work. So I completely agree. My big thing I think for today was really talking about, we have this idea of behavioral health right now. There's a big focus on whole person healthcare, whole person, you know, focusing on those other areas in life. And we had that understanding a long time ago. We already knew that we had to have a balance within ourselves. We had to have a balance in our community. And so we were called savages. We were portrayed this way. We had these negative stereotypes that are placed with us still as being the drunken natives, as being these, you know, people who don't know how to act right. But all of the things that we had in place prior to colonization and assimilation are things that are now being brought back and saying, oh, you know, art therapy is really good. And this is an alternative to how to help each other. When we already knew that this was a way of life. And so the more that we're able to get back to our cultural ways, being able to understand them, I think the better that we'll see things going within our communities. But there still is that lateral oppression so much, because these are things that have been taught to us. The abuse and all of those things that are negative stereotypes put on Natives are things that were taught to us through the systems that we were forced to be in.
Thank
I'll kind
you.
of stop there.
Well, I was going to say, so we have about 5 minutes before we go to the breakout sessions, and I wanted to get to one thing that both of you mentioned. First of all, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act that you mentioned, the Supreme Court has consistently undermined the authority and influence of that law. So it's still very frustrating. So it's a perfect example of the ongoing effects of colonization. But when we were discussing, both of you mentioned relatives and community multiple times. And when we were preparing for this conversation, Ted brought up being and becoming good relatives several times. So before we go to the breakout sessions, what does this mean to each of you?
I'll go first. So in Lakota philosophy, you know, we have Lakota, huh? Oh, you might have heard of that. That's a Lakota way of looking at the world, huh? Is living in peace and harmony with all our relatives. Huh? And so that pretty much focuses on what is being a good relative. What is it? What is a good relative? And so we're talking about respecting one another, right? And we're not only talking about human beings respecting other human beings, but we're talking about all living beings here, right? All our relatives, huh? We are all related, huh? All my relations, thank you, thank you. That means those trees and those plants and those, all of those living beings, huh? That we're a part of, that give us life each and every day, huh? Those trees that gave us oxygen, we give them our carbon. It's a relationship that we have with everything. And so I think that's critical. You were talking about the effects of colonization and everything. Yes, we went through that and we're still feeling that effect, huh? And but if we can get back to being, to looking at being a good relative, especially within our own families, huh? Our Tiwahes and our Tioshpaes, huh? First and foremost, we have to start with our Tiwahes, our families, being a good relative to each other in our families, huh? Our Unchis, our grandmas, our lalas, our grandpas, okay? All of those need to be good relatives with them, and then go outside of the Tiwahe, the family, go into the extended family, the Tioshpaes, and then extend your relationships as you go out. It's a ripple effect, huh? And so, you know, that's the concept, huh? That traditionally Lakotas grow up with. And that was taken away from us when Echohawk was talking about the boarding schools, huh? That concept was taken away from us, but we're getting back to that now, huh? Huh? So you guys are all my relations, huh? Thank you, huh? That's what that means. I'll stop there.
Also, just to real quick, just for me, you know, being a Navajo Diné person, we say "Ke'ehotzil." Ke'ehotzil just means that family is what kind of keeps you strong moving forward. And so having a family, you know, close to you and being able to reach out like Ted was talking about is being a good relative, being a good auntie, being a good uncle, a good dad, a good mom, a good cousin. And then, you know, as Native peoples, we just kind of naturally invite people, you know, to be our relatives. Oh, it's my brother, that's my sister, that's my cousin, that's my whatever, you know. It's just, even though there's no blood relation, that's how we, you know, make those relations. And then we treat them that way. You know, hey, don't talk that way to my brother. Hey, don't talk that way to my sister. Don't talk that way to my uncle, my auntie, or, you know, listen to you, and whatever, things like that. And so that's kind of what makes us strong in as far as Native peoples, you know, that ability to extend those relations outside of, you know, those blood relationships, and to be able to treat others in that same regard. So just to echo what Ted was saying, and I'll let Nicole and everybody, Christina, answer.
You know, we have a word in my language, Lakotas, of Wamakashkashka. These are the beings that roam the earth. And so the beings that roam the earth that have movement. And that's very important to understand that concept of how deep that is, because now you're talking about the Wichakpioyate, the star nation, and the moons, and the water and the air. And you look at the trees and how they dance and how they interact with each other. And it's not like this, you know, it's like this as the trees blow, you know, and the wind blows and makes the trees dance. And so understanding that, you know, all of our indigenous languages, we don't have that word or that concept of animal, because that creates that hierarchy that doesn't exist with us. And so that's how beautiful that is. And we also have a word that we call hunkatapi. Hunkatapi is a ceremony in which we adopt. And so we only, you know, we might have our immediate family, but then as Echo and Ted were talking about of gathering kinship as in our travels and through our lives, we do adopt, and they become, you know, my nieces, nephews. And so, you know, when I talk about my kids in the OPS school system, I talk about, you know, the 750 kids that are there. So that's how important that is, and how that lineage and that relationship extends out to our kinship.
Christina, did you want to offer your perspective?
You know, they pretty much said everything. I think we're all so much on the same page that we're just kind of echoing each other. But I don't know what I could add to those three great comments that would make it any better than what it just was. Thank you, though.
Anything you want to add, Nicole?
Yeah, so I'm gonna read just something real quick that I had kind of put down was, being a good relative is coming with a good heart, supporting, giving of your time and the things that we are able to do, lending our voices when requested, forgiving shortcomings, being able to show empathy and humility, that no one is better than another, that we are all here to coexist with each other, learn from each other, stand up for each other, and remember all our relatives are important, that we have relatives that are enduring the suffering for the rest of us, so that we may continue to move forward and begin to thrive. We have relatives that carry our burdens so that some of us don't have to. These relatives need our prayers and thanks just as much as the rest of us. And that kind of goes back to when Steve was talking in the beginning of his prayer, is remembering our relatives who are suffering, that are in the jails, that are suffering out here, that are homeless. We believe that, you know, they're enduring those pains and carrying those hurts for a lot of our families, that so that we can keep moving forward for the next generations, but they're sacrificing themselves to carry that burden for those that they love. So that was kind of where I went with it too.
Nicole, thank you so much. I think that's a really great transition to the breakout session. So I think, Dominic, are you gonna explain how we do this?
Yeah, actually Colin will be. So Colin.
Okay.
Perfect. Here I am. Awesome. Yeah, we have these breakout rooms all created, and each one has a facilitator already placed in there that'll have some questions that'll guide us through that discussion. You won't have to do anything to get in the rooms or get out of them. You'll be automatically put into them and automatically brought back. And then just in terms of some separate agreements that we've always created for these breakout rooms, the first one just being one mouth, one mic. So that meaning, right, one person is just talking at a time. We also have just like a general rule of respect, also knowing that these sessions aren't being recorded as well. Some other things that we always like to highlight here. Making space and taking space, making sure that we're allowing those in our group to share and being conscious of how much space we might be taking up, keeping an open mind. And then finally, this Vegas twist, which really the takeaway from that is these stories stay, but the lessons leave, right? Meaning that we hope that folks share lived experiences and be vulnerable in those groups, but knowing that we maybe want to leave some sort of confidentiality or anonymity and not necessarily leave that space with people's stories as talking points, but really leave with those lessons instead. So I think those are the ones that we wanted to highlight. Dominic, anything we need to add?
No, we'll just be going to these breakout rooms for 20 minutes. And then please make sure that you assign somebody from the group who will be sharing out. We'll go through and do a minute share out from each group. So either that's the facilitator from the group or somebody else within the group, just make sure to have that ready.
Perfect.
I think we're ready. Absolutely. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you all have some good conversations in your breakout rooms. We're going to go through and have some share outs. Before we do that, I will let you know our ASL interpreter lost her internet connection. Cox is doing some work in our area and has no internet. So we have turned on the live closed caption transcript feature to be utilized as well. With that, let's, from our group with Tina as a facilitator, if somebody can share out from that group, maybe 2 to 3 highlights that you all talked about.
Anyone want to share?
Is that our group?
I'll step up.
Yes.
I'll give
Thanks, Doris.
I'll give it a shot. I want to say that we had probably one really dominant theme in our conversation, and that was in the commonalities of culture as lived experience in the Native American world and as the expressed intention of some of the white world that came to the United States. I'm trying to be very careful with my choice of words there, but you know, we all share individually. We all share a commonality of intention for being responsible to and for each other and the people around us and the world around us, the environment around us, the other organisms around us, and looking for living in peace and harmony at an individual level, but that our cultures express that in different ways, and sometimes what is described is not what's delivered. And sometimes that really takes a toll. And in this case, in the United States, it took a toll on the Native population and still does.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that out, Doris. We'll move on to our second group. This was led by Candace and Pam. Who would like to shout from that group?
And so I think three of the biggest things that kind of were referenced multiple times in our question was, the first thing was the importance of this authenticity of knowledge, and making sure that the things are shared are truly authentic and true, whether that be in education or in a historical aspect. And then when we were discussing, a few of the people in our breakout room referenced settler's guilt and how that was something that really took them aback as we're having this discussion. It really made them kind of take a step back and kind of think about that in a larger context. And then the third thing I would say was our group had a lot of discussion of how we can be better relatives in the community, and maybe not knowing now how we can, but taking time to reflect on that, so we can be better for the people around us, our relatives, our friends, or any of the work that we do at our jobs, in our personal life, or just in the organization or community as a whole.
Thank you, Candace. Our next group was facilitated by Alina. Anybody in this group would like to share out maybe 2 to 3 highlights that you all talked about? So in this room, we had Amy, Jared, Leah, Maxwell, Patty, Susie, and Tammy.
Yes, if no one else will jump in, I will, but I want to give somebody the opportunity to do so first.
I think that's their
Okay.
cue to go ahead.
Me. So in our breakout room, we really, you know, some things that really stood out to us was treasuring the connections. Our Native Indigenous relatives being a larger group and making space for themselves rather because they're not always invited. That's something that really stood out to us, like this idea of invisibility, right? That oppression is still something that we need to be aware of. Something that we really talked about was kind of education. How can we start to educate ourselves at a younger age, our youth, maybe starting at elementary school, right? This idea of textbook material or, you know, the week of or the month of, but like really incorporating real life connections to the stories. How can we do better in our education systems? If South Dakota, that's, you know, our neighbor, their curriculum and they're just beyond what Nebraska is doing. How come we're not able to adapt, right? And questioning also, questioning or challenging current holidays that we celebrate, that you hold respect to, like Thanksgiving, you know, without questioning or challenging why. And we're just really hopeful, you know, that educators in the future will allow for opportunities to make these things real, share more experiences, allow us to connect to individuals, and having something similar to this be incorporated into curriculum at an elementary school level.
Thank you for that, Alina. Our next group was facilitated by Cami. We had Carla, Christina, Fernando, Gwenna,
Gwenna and Mary. Yeah.
Jacqueline and Mary. Yeah.
So I was a bad facilitator and forgot to ask, so I won't make anyone of go. I forgot I'd tell you all about this, but a couple things that we talked about, and then I am going to call on Jacqueline because she was, as we were just wrapping up, she was sharing some really great insights. But we just talked about the times in which Native peoples are left out of the conversation, especially, and Christina really brought up a point about the number of missing Native and Indigenous women and girls around the country, and how that's just completely not in our media, or it's not talked about. And this is not only in the US, but also in North and Central and South America. And Mary brought up the injustices happening with Indigenous peoples in both Chile and Argentina. So all of that was really one of the key things that we were talking about, just the being left out, but then also the mistreatment not even being talked about or discussed as something that our countries, and Gwenna being from Canada, mentioning that there is a truth and reconciliation agreement that's the country has done, but still little has really been done to enact those changes. And then as we were talking about how we could be better advocates individually, Jacqueline was bringing up a point about the land recognition and payment. So I would like to ask Jacqueline if she wants to just kind of share that thought.
Yeah, it was just kind of like, I know that it seems to be like right now that it's like trending as far as like having like land acknowledgements, but not necessarily doing enough like research, you know, about like what that really means. And even as our organization is like kind of thinking about what are the best ways that we can, you know, lead in that like authentically, you know, like what are some like real actionable items that we can take on as an organization to, you know, provide some like assistance. And one of those things that is, I think is always important when we're asking folks to contribute is that we pay folks for their contributions. It doesn't, you know, so if you're like, even like, you know, instead of just like doing the coffee, you know, give them like, you know, give them $10 or whatever you have available when people are sharing this information, because to the point that I feel like was made earlier is it's like when you're in a place where you have to educate others, it is an all the time thing. It does not stop. You're constantly having to share that education. So there should be compensation with that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacqueline and Cami, for sharing out. Our next group was facilitated by Mandy. Who from this group would like to share out? Maybe two highlights that you all talked about.
Yes, I'll share two things. So the first one, we didn't get a chance to talk too much about feelings, which is kind of one of my most favorite parts of these conversations, how we felt as we were learning and discussing these things. One that came up though was a craving for more belonging, which we saw, I think the non-native people in the conversation, or at least some of us white people, felt like we were lacking that deep belonging. And the second thing touches on what a lot of you have shared. Now I'm forgetting his name. Echohawk was mentioning in the chat that like intergenerational trauma could be a week or a semester long conversation. So our second big takeaway was just, we really want to learn more, and we have so much curiosity about this. The Indian Religious Act of 1978, how family structures were changed. And so in terms of our actions moving forward, I think learning was a big, self-education was a big theme.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And our last group was facilitated by Cornelius. Who from this group would like to share out?
I was going to ask if anybody wanted from our group wanted to share out quickly. If not, I did write some things down that I thought were a good synopsis of our convo. Okay, cool. I'll take that as I could go ahead. So I think a lot of the things that we talked about in our breakout room, I think echoes some of the things that other people also brought up in their rooms, talking about the importance of acknowledging the ways that Native people are modern and are still living on this land and are still here, how important it is when someone had brought up, I think it was Lauren, please excuse me if it wasn't, someone had brought up that they had seen and had heard a land acknowledgement by, I think it was the Cincinnati, an indigenous tribe in Cincinnati, and they talked about how not only are they acknowledging the history of the land, but also how they are on the land currently and are still there and are still living. Also talked about the ways that the invisibility of Native and Indigenous communities is really intentional, especially intentional in ways like here in Nebraska and in other places, how all of those things are super intentional, and how we need to be also really intentional about highlighting those voices and uplifting those voices so they're a part of the conversation more often. We talked a little bit about the invisibility of how we don't see Native American communities in urban city areas as often as we see other groups of people, and how that is even really intentional. Steve had brought up the Relocation Act and the part that that played, and the way, and acknowledging that there are 109 different tribes in the city, but there's not a whole lot, if really any, visual identifiers of the history of Indigenous people, and that they have been here for a long time and are still here, but there's not very many visual indicators of that in the city. And just touching on the fact that Native and Indigenous people are continuously having to not only educate people constantly about their culture and themselves, but also the culture of like the state that we live in and the historical context behind the names like Omaha and everything that goes into that. So I hope that was a good synopsis. And in the chat, Barbara, who is part of my group, also added some great documentaries that she uses for her graduate students. So I thought those were some great resources as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cornelius. And I would like to just let everybody know, because we are running out of time here, that you will all be receiving a follow-up email later this week or early next week that will include all the resources that have been put in the chat, some of the resources that our panelists and Tracy have talked about, so that you can continue to learn and to educate yourself as well. And so at this point, Tracy, I know you have a last question for the panelists, maybe sharing out just real quickly one way that they would suggest that we all can get more involved.
Yeah, I was going to say, if each of you could point to one issue that our audience might consider learning more about, what would it be for you? And I know that's a tough question because these are complex and interrelated concerns, but you want to start, Christina?
Yeah, you know, we kind of talked about this question before, and I thought that I knew what I was going to talk about, but after being in that breakout room, it made me change my mind a little bit. And then to piggyback off of what Cornelius was just talking about is education. You know, when I'm very privileged in some areas because I'm very light skinned, so nobody knows that I'm Native American right off the bat. But once they find out, they ask me about Native Americans in general. You know, they completely bypass what I said, where I'm from and whatever, and ask me about every Indian from coast to coast. And I will have to admit, I don't know about every single other tribe. So probably, you know, if there's a particular nation or something of interest, learn about that particular nation. If you are just interested in Native American indigenous culture as a whole, look at taking a class, you know, UNO, Metro. A lot of our colleges and universities around the country offer courses in basic. Tracy, you know, Tracy is an educator. So, you know, take a class, read a book. Don't always rely on that one Native American person, you know, to teach you everything about every Native American. So nothing in particular, just a general statement.
And I'll just go in order as I see you on my screen. How, Nicole?
Yeah, I think show up. We have been fighting this fight for a long time on our own, and we have repeatedly stepped up when others are being kind of pushed down and oppressed, and we see those injustices because we know how it is, but a lot of times we don't have anybody show up for us when it's about us. So show up. I completely agree with what you're saying, Christina. Our youth even get that. They get the tokenized Native in the classroom. But then even just, you know, it was touched in one of the other groups talking about taking our narrative as our truth and accepting that even if you don't want to hear it and it doesn't align with what everything else has been taught and told to you before. But we know that history repeats itself if we allow it to do so, and it won't just be us. You know, it could be another 100 years from now, but it would be another population. It could be us again. The purpose of the systems that were put in place to assimilate and colonize everything going on with us were to make us extinct. I added in the chat there, you know, that natives, along with racehorses and dogs, are the only ones who go on a pedigree, that we have to prove who we are. We are the only people, literally across the board, that have to be able to prove to a degree of that we're native because we are. And that's part of the kind of colonization that has been ingrained into the tribal governments that we have as well. But also, let's be real, we are very strong, resilient, amazing people that through all of these things that we talk about, that we are still here. We are very present, that with all the atrocities and all this and that, we do have healthy families. We do have young people who are staying substance abuse free, who are remembering who they are as people, who are revitalizing their culture and that understanding of who we were, who we are, and who we can continue to learn to grow to be. So we don't want pity from people. We want people to understand and empathize that they get that we have had these things happen, acknowledge it, but now let's go forward and keep moving. And then I just wanted to acknowledge again that our brothers and our families down in the South as well. Thank you, Guillermo, for bringing that up earlier, is we are related. We are, you know, we are native, they are native to these lands just as the Native Americans that are tribal people. So they are the same indigenous people that we are. They have every right to be here. And the boundaries that we see put in place are ones that the government has put in place. These are not ones that existed prior to colonization. So that's what I got.
All right, Echohawk, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about, but I think in regards to the question about what to look at is that historical trauma piece. I mean, like I had mentioned, it can be related to all peoples of color. And yes, thank you, for bringing up our relatives to the South. A lot of our nations went down into Central America, South America on a regular basis. In my group, I talked about, that term nomadic, and we were really strategically migratory, and what we did, we went around to where the plants were, the animals were, and some of that was, down into Central South America. And so it just so happened that when the Europeans showed up, all the people that were here, and when they drew that line, they said, well, you guys are down there and we're over here. And same with our First Nations relatives up to the north. So, but the multi-generational trauma is something that will give a lot of light to why Native peoples are in the situations that we are today. And just kind of what Nicole had talked about, it's not a pity party. It's really about, understanding who we are as a people and then empowering. I think a lot of my job and the role that I do is helping to empower our young people, to help them to understand, this history. But despite this history, we're still here and we're still a strong people, and we're still, going to make a way for our young people for the future. And that's the way that our prayers, are said, is that, there was generations before me that prayed for me before I even got here. And so today we're praying for those generations to come as well. So my great grandchildren, I probably won't see them, but, they're going to have prayers for me already said for them before they even show up. And so it's continuing that way of life and that way of being. So thank you.
Thank you. And Ted.
Thank you. Just want to kind of leave everybody with the idea that, as Indigenous people, we had a spiritual relationship with the earth and all living things. And you can see kind of the condition of what's going on with the world right now, that all the climate issues that are going on and so forth and so on. So in working with the tribal communities here in Nebraska, we're trying to get back to that traditional worldview of how we work, that relationship that we have with Unchi Maka, Grandmother Earth, and all that she provides for us. And I think if you as non-natives can try and understand that, and to bring that forward with your families and so forth and so on, is that that spiritual relationship with the earth, and that she takes care of us if we take care of her. And that concept, I'm trying to get more and more people at UNL, especially the people in the agricultural department, to understand that relationship that natives have, that we have with the earth, and so that we can maybe try and treat our grandmother earth with a little more kindness, and understand that what we do to her damages us as well. So just want to kind of just leave that with you as non-native people, is try to understand that concept, and try and bring that forward if you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you to all of everybody on the panel today, and Tracy for moderating this conversation. Thank you to everybody for attending today. I know we are at our 1 o'clock mark, but but I did want to point out we've had some great resources shared in the chat. We will be including those in our follow-up email later this week or early next week, along with our link to today's event evaluation. We would love to have your feedback on how you felt like today went and what we could continue to improve on, along with links to our future Omaha Table Talks conversations. So thank you again for being here with us this afternoon, and we hope to see you at our future event.